Hello and welcome to the Internet of Things Made Simple. I'm Larry Bohumer. This is episode number 7, and I thank you for joining us. In our main topic tonight, we're going to talk about IoT and health, namely how it keeps you, and just as importantly, your family, much healthier. But before we get into that, we're going to talk about Mars, and specifically how IoT is going to help build some possible houses that are on the planet Mars. I'm not much of a space travel guy. I did enjoy the movie The Martian, not so much how we had to grow food, and if you haven't seen it, this part probably will be disturbing to you as well. The idea of living on Mars has always been something that many people have believed is our future, and there's so many problems that we have to overcome. The first is that Mars is basically a desert, and not in a good way. It's a very cold one, with temperatures that are much lower than we even see in places like Calgary, down to minus 81 in fact. Equally important, there's very little water, and they have some wicked sandstorms, what I've seen, so it makes me wonder, is it really a place that we can build on? Well, luckily, it doesn't look like it'll be humans that will do the building, as IoT is powering robots that will do the building for us. It's not so simple as just shipping up a bunch of IKEA-type boxes and have the robot fight with their spouse like the rest of us do to try to assemble the houses. It's going to be more difficult than that. They're going to first have to find the materials, and they're going to have to create something called Martian concrete. I wasn't quite sure what that was. They're going to use IoT to help locate and to make sure the mixing itself, all the ratios, are done well. Once they build the infrastructure, IoT sensors are going to be vital because, as I mentioned, the conditions are so harsh, you have to make sure that the optimal conditions are there for things like indoor gardens. The other part is that exposure to minus 81 is life-threatening for humans, so it's something we have to make sure that we have a good understanding of, so temperature sensor is going to play a big part of that. The goal is to have a few tourists spend some weeks there, and perhaps some people will spend up to a year there. So there's going to have to be a lot of food created and housing and different activities, so this is a huge project. It might seem like a short amount of time, actually, to spend time there, just a few weeks, considering that a trip can take several or up to 8 months. I can't say that even if the trip was free, I would be rip-roaring excited to do it myself, but based on how people are today, I'm sure a lot of people will be excited to be the first on Mars. When we come back from a short break, we're going to talk about how IoT is changing your health and that of your family. Back in 5 seconds. Okay, welcome back. We're going to divide the parts about health into 3 sections, and that's going to be first how it's changing your personal health, the second is how it's going to change the health of your loved ones, and third is how IoT is changing healthcare in general, and that includes things like a trip to the doctor's office and to the hospital. You don't have to go very far today to see an ad for some kind of wearable device. Whether it's something that you pin to your chest, whether it's a wearable on the wrist, whether it's a necklace, one worn on the belt, it seems like there's no shortage of wearables out there today. Some people, like my parents, just call them Fitbits, because they assume that every device that's worn on the wrist is a Fitbit. And the Fitbits of the world took off based on things like your steps. The story I like to tell about this is that some people get so obsessed with the amount of steps they take, they actually walk back and forth in the hall of a hotel until they hit 10,000 steps, and then they decide to yell to their friends, "I hit 10,000 steps at 10:30 at night right outside of my hotel room." I have no idea who this lady was, but I hope by some chance you're listening. Please stop doing that. They had then started to get a bit more advanced, and that's where the latest generation are for wearables. If you look at what Apple did with their newest watch, it's all about biometrics. Your heart rate has been there for a while, but you're starting to see a little more advancement to that. Things like being able to detect a possible heart issue. I do advise people very heavily, and we're going to talk about this in a future podcast, do not use a wearable that's meant for consumers if you are prone or have some major issue with your heart or any other part on your body for that matter. Use professional grade equipment. The next area for biometrics is going to be blood pressure, and you're already starting to see things along those lines on the wearables. There always was an emphasis as well on sleep, because the amount of sleep you get has a huge influence on your overall health. One of the issues, though, is as you start to add more things to these devices, it puts more of a drain on the battery, meaning that many of these devices, like the Apple Watch, barely make it through a day, let alone 2, 3, 4, 5 days. So many people charge them at night. And the problem with that is that you're not monitoring your sleep with that. And we're going to talk about some of the other solutions for sleep in a bit. In general, wearables used to be what I would refer to as the pet rocks of the electronics world. For those of you who aren't familiar, pet rocks were a bit of a joke gift that were given to many people. I think it was probably in the 70s and 80s. And it was funny. You got a pet rock, you put it in the drawer, and then you forgot about it. And maybe you found it, 6 months later or more. A lot of people, when they get wearables, that's exactly what happens. They think about it for a while. They wear it on their wrists for a little bit. They show off to their friends. They are a bit obsessed with their steps. But then it kind of wears off. And then over time, you forget to put it on. Maybe you don't put it on for a few days. And then like that pet rock, it ends up in your drawer. As these devices seem to progress a little bit, you're seeing that less and less, but it still is an issue for the industry. Aside from wearables, you do see a lot of devices that fall into the area that I call home health machines. And that's some of the blood pressure cuffs. I have one that I keep on my bed, and every morning I take my blood pressure. For me, I do it to make sure I'm not training too hard and running and other activities. But for other people, there's a huge value in taking your blood pressure every morning. And we're going to talk about that a little later on when we talk about the doctor's office visits. The second area of home health, which is extremely popular, is in the scale side, and that's the smart scales. These devices, when you step on them, they'll transmit your results up to the cloud, and that's not only your weight, it's also things like your fat content, your water content, muscle mass, depending on what your scale can monitor. One important reason to use a smart scale, especially if you use a wearable, is that by keeping track of your accurate weight, it can better estimate the amount of calories you're burning. So if your weight goes down, you're going to burn a little less calories, and vice versa if your weight goes up. Very similar to your heart rate. These are not deadly accurate numbers. I don't think you're going to get an exact fat content from a scale that you step on that puts a little bit of a mild pulse through your feet. However, it's what I would call accurate enough, or consistently inaccurate is another term I've also heard. And what I mean by that is, if you got on the scale one day and it said you had 20% body fat and you were down to say 15 after a few weeks of working out, it might not be 20 and 15, but the thinking is that you have lost several percentages of your body fat. So it's good enough, and it gives you a good indication as to how you're doing. The third area has to do with eating. And I have to admit, at CES, I actually laughed out loud when I saw this, and I felt bad for doing it. The gentleman was showing me a smart fork and a smart plate. And I thought, that seemed like the craziest idea I've ever seen. And then he started to explain to me that a couple of the issues, by having a smart plate, it can help keep track of your overall calories in a much more accurate way. And it kind of works well with a smart fork because it introduces something called cadence. If you're into running or music, you know that cadence is the pace of something. Apparently, most people have too fast of a cadence when they eat. And by slowing down the cadence, you can allow your body to catch up and you won't overeat as much. Kind of makes sense if you think about it. I don't know if you need to spend $50, $80, $100 on a smart fork, but if it does the job of keeping you from overeat, then it probably is worth it. Along the lines of eating is allergy testing. Knock on wood, neither of my two kids have any significant allergy issues, neither do my wife and I. However, many of our friends, including my kids' classmates, have everything from different nut allergies to celiac disease and other unfortunate ailments. Smartphones are working in conjunction with smart utensils and smart testing to be able to test for these things. And that way you just either dip a little probe into the food and it will test to make sure that there isn't what's not supposed to be in there. It also works apparently for things like caffeine. A lot of times they mix up, caffeinated and decaffeinated coffee. You can check your coffee that way as well. The last area of home health machines has to do with thermometers. I apparently, as I found out afterwards, was one of the lucky ones because my mom put the thermometer in my mouth. Other people have told me the story about other ways their mom took temperatures, and I really feel bad for you. It must be something you have to tell your therapist if that's the case. Smart thermometers are great, and they were around for both of my kids. And I have to admit, it's a much easier to first get an accurate reading because you can get a very quick temperature from a child. It also allows you to do it more frequently, and it will keep track of the information in the cloud. So if you do have to go to the hospital, you can show them, I gave the medication at this time, and this was the temperature, and the doctor or nurse will have much more information on the ability to control the fever, as an example. Before I leave the area of personal health, I'm going to talk about 3 examples that perhaps somebody else will understand the appeal to these. I kind of equate them to Brussels sprouts. My wife loves them. I don't see the appeal to them. I think they're disgusting. So perhaps it is just a matter of, to each their own. The first is that obviously being regular is important, and I hope you understand what I mean by regular. And, eating healthy and these things, it's part of an overall healthy lifestyle. However, I don't know if you need to have competitions with your friends, as this one service has, as to who was more effective. I can see that for steps and for running. Don't see it for being regular, though. The second one is that it's great to keep track of your heartbeats. And if you have issues with your heart, perhaps you want to have your family know if you're having an irregular heartbeat. And some of the wearables do a great job of that. And we're going to talk about that in a sec on looking after your family. However, I don't know if you need to have a notification sent out to your family of your last heartbeat. That just seemed a little weird to me, but again, perhaps it's the Brussels sprout thing. The final example has to do with stress. And a lot of these wearables are starting to get quite good at detecting if you're stressed. I'm not sure how they do it, but if you look back upon a day, we'll say you had a stressful day. And when I examine my day, often I did. So it kind of makes sense. These devices will try to help control stress. Great thing. However, they do it by sending really loud audible alarms. I don't know about you, but that would cause me to be more stressed. So again, to each their own. The next area we're going to talk about is how it's helping us to care for our loved ones. I kind of divide caring for loved ones into 3 areas. The first would be your parents perhaps are just getting a bit older, no real issues, but you kind of want to look out for them. The second kind would fall under the special needs category, but that might be, say, a temporary special need. So perhaps your parents are coming home after recovering from a heart attack, or they're having some kind of recovery after a fall. So once they make the recovery, they should be relatively back to normal again. The third type is special needs that are much more of a permanent condition. This could be physical, cognitive, emotional. Perhaps it's things like dementia, autism, progressive disease like diabetes that is unlikely to get better. All of these things have their own great examples that are covered by IoT. One way we do it is by smart home. And this would be whether they're in your home, staying in one of your rooms, or it's tools to help them live alone. And they're very similar to the smart home applications that you might see from Amazon and other services. And that's things like watering the lawn, automatically locking doors, turning off lights. All these things help to keep people safe. The second area has to do with smart medication, and there's a few variables here as to how it's done. Some of them have Bluetooth sensors on the top of medication bottles, and that way you can know if mom or dad took their medication or didn't take it. Other ones are blister packs. So in the case of people that might have 3 or 4 different medications to take at varying times of the day, these little packs have what's required at certain times, all put in the same blister. Same as the pill bottles, you can know if the blister hasn't been pierced by a certain time of the day. Equally important is the correct dosage. And where we're starting to see this is that some of the pill bottles have weight sensors in them. So it knows the weight of the pill bottle, and it knows the rough weight of an actual pill, so it can do a quick calculation to know that too many pills have been taken or not enough. Obviously, these kind of solutions introduce a different area of concern, and that's a lack of privacy. What you're starting to see now to help increase the privacy for this sector is a lot of non-intrusive solutions. These are solutions using things like heat sensing and sonar, and they combine that with artificial intelligence. So it doesn't know who's in your parents' home, so they could have a guest over, things like that. And it doesn't really know what's going on in terms of for their privacy, but it will learn that this heat source over here, which you can tell it is the stove, is supposed to come on, say by 8 o'clock in the morning. It's now 10 o'clock in the morning and this heat source hasn't come on yet. And it could send you a note. Along the same lines, it should know that the majority of the upstairs of the house should be roughly the same temperature, and this one area now has a huge blast of cold air, so perhaps your parents have left the window open in the middle of winter time. Many people as they get older don't have issues with remembering, but instead have issues with mobility. Some of the great solutions that I've seen are based on sensors to be able to find if somebody's having different issues, such as a bad hip getting worse, or they're not recovering from surgery. And these are usually done by sensors being worn, sometimes on a daily basis, and this allows to measure the progress, good or bad, of your loved one. Some people, whether it's just a balance issue or, again, perhaps recovering from a hip surgery, may have a concern about falling. And obviously, you want to prevent the falling, and that's what those sensors before would do, but some falls are inevitable. And the best way to help out in the case of a fall, and I say this in all seriousness, is why not deploy an airbag? And that's what you're starting to see now. There are things that can be worn around the waist that if it detects a certain amount of drop in elevation, it will deploy the airbag. And so the person's still going to fall, but at least they're going to have a bit of a padded landing. Included in that is the ability to notify. So if the airbag goes off, in this case, very similar to if a car airbag goes off, a text can be sent to a loved one or even to 911, depending on how it's set up. One of the issues that's becoming more pressing in our society is Parkinson's disease. I've said many times in the past, a person that I've idolized for many years is Michael J. Fox. Not only because of his acting career, I've actually enjoyed seeing the great work he's done to help people with Parkinson's. One of the issues with a disease like Parkinson's is that you have to be able to get information as to the intensity and the duration of an incident or a tremor. And in many cases, the person is not able to give accurate information. This is where wearables are helping. They're able to detect information about the tremor, but equally important, they're able to put some intelligence to it to see if they're getting better or worse, and that can be mapped against different medication. Another area of concern for people, and this is more on the cognitive side, is wandering. And that's whether it's dementia for some of the people in a certain age bracket, perhaps it's autism or some other ailments as well. There's a few ways this can be helped. The first is on home access control. There are solutions that can prevent people from leaving if they're not supposed to, and whether that's locking the doors or the gates, things like that. The second area for people who might be a bit more mobile is using GPS-enabled devices. They're a little more intelligent and a little smarter than perhaps an Apple Watch or a Samsung Watch. These devices allow for two-way voice calls to be initiated without the person doing anything. They often have different fall detections. There's usually software on the back end that can keep track of if the person is where they're supposed to be or perhaps they haven't arrived by the time you thought they would have. The last kind of concern for wandering, it's not necessarily because the person doesn't know what they're doing due to different issues. It's more about biometrics, and this could be someone recovering from, say, a heart attack, and they shouldn't have their heart rate over a certain level. These devices are quite effective and much more effective than a consumer-based device at detecting a possible rise in the heart rate or even a certain drop in the heart rate as well. The last area for looking after elderly and special needs has to do with driving. And again, there's a privacy aspect to it. People don't want their kids or their family members to know exactly where they're going. And people are often very reluctant to give up the keys, and it makes it very difficult. The driving solutions that are aimed at this demographic tend to be more based on driving characteristics. So are they slamming on the brakes more than they should be? Are they taking more aggressive turns? Are they driving well under the speed limit or well over the speed limit? And this allows you, as well as for you to show the person just what's going on, and it kind of lets you have the talk, if you want to call it that. The third main area for healthcare has to do with how it changes your doctor's visits, as well as how it changes the hospital experience. One concern about going to the doctor, and I just think back to Ferris Bueller's Day Off, how he said how bad the doctor's was, is that it can cause something called white coat hypertension. Try saying that really quickly. And that's where you may not have a problem with your blood pressure or your heart rate, but the second you walk into their office, poof, everything skyrockets. And now the doctor doesn't know what to go on. You're telling them you're healthy, but they can see otherwise. And by showing them trends, so here's my last 6 months of heart rate or blood pressure or other things like that, the doctor is able to see not only the trend about your health, but also things like if a new medication is affecting your sleep and other patterns. The second area is mobile healthcare, and this has to do with things like mobile surgery. 4G, which was one of the cell technologies, started to enable some mobile healthcare. 5G will take that one step further. And that's the proverbial mobile surgery, but more importantly, it's mobile exams. So if you live in an extreme rural area, the doctor would be able to do an examination, and the nurse locally would be able to administer some of the things, like move the stethoscope, that kind of stuff. And this allows for better healthcare, especially for rural patients. The other area of mobile healthcare is sending people home. A lot of hospital beds are kept by people who probably should go home, but they kind of need a bit of extra monitoring, and maybe there's no one to do it, or maybe there's some concern about sending them home. By having more mobile healthcare and different products that can be brought into some of these people's homes, you can now have them go home earlier. They used to try to do it on Wi-Fi, but a lot of people who are in that age bracket maybe don't have a Wi-Fi network everywhere. So most of these solutions are now cellular powered. The last area has to do with IoT and in the hospital. There's a few ways it's helping. One is keeping track of a crash cart and other key items, which made me kind of wonder when I first read that, but kind of makes sense. Hospitals are pretty busy and you lose track of things. So by having GPS-based tracking on key items, you can not only make sure they're not stolen, you can make sure they're where they're supposed to be when you need them. Think back to the worst coffee you ever had, and there's a good chance it came from a hospital vending machine. So the idea of a vending machine in a hospital gives most people a bit of the creeps. What you're seeing now is a better use for vending machines, and that's to keep track of consumables. So a nurse, for instance, would come along, scan their badge, and they would be able to get bandages. That would not only make sure that they're not stolen, but would also make sure that there's better inventory tracking as well. Speaking of tracking, keeping track of patients is difficult, especially in a big hospital. Some people are mobile and other ones are going down for tests. So you're starting to see more IoT solutions keeping track of people outside the ward. But even inside the ward, and specifically inside the room, you're starting to see IoT solutions. The old joke was that the nurse woke me up to give me a sleeping pill, and that often is because the nurse not only had to give you a sleeping pill, but they had to do a bit of a routine check. You're starting to see sonar applications and heat sensing and other technologies to be able to track the movement of a patient and to read their temperature. So now you can know not only the overall body temperature of a patient, you can also see, for instance, if one part of the body is warmer, which could indicate a fever or some kind of an infection. You can imagine that hospital equipment kind of has to always work, whether that's things in the operating room, MRI machines. IoT is very much a part of that. Equipment now has IoT by the manufacturer to be able to monitor whether maintenance is required or even predict possible failures. The last part has to do with sending patients home, and this is kind of what I was talking about with mobile healthcare. You're starting to see a lot of hospitals send people home with wearables, and especially the higher end wearables. So if a patient was perhaps prone to wandering a little bit, and they shouldn't really still be in the hospital because they're better, but sending them home could actually leave them more vulnerable, that's where the wearables come in. When we come back from a 5-second break, we're going to talk about how IoT is helping to stop something that I wish it would do even more, and that's stopping school shootings. Back in 5 seconds. Okay, welcome back. Even living in a place like Canada, where we don't have as many shootings per capita as in parts of the US, it doesn't mean that any area or any school is immune from violence. Because remember, the violence that could happen at a school doesn't necessarily have to start at the school. It could be a robbery gone bad at a nearby mall. It could be some kind of a domestic dispute that happened to spread into the school. There really is many ways it can happen. And IoT is doing its part. The first is by detecting weapons. And that's perhaps before the weapons even come in the first place. And this is out in the schoolyard. You're seeing detectors being put in that people don't realize are there. A warning can be given to the people inside that somebody has just crossed over into the schoolyard with a weapon, and that can force an automatic lockdown of the doors, as an example. Assuming that wasn't in place, the second area of detection has to do with audio. And it's very specific weapons, whether it's the loading of a weapon, the cocking of a weapon, or even the discharge of a weapon. These noises have a very distinct pitch. And so if systems can detect, using audio sensors, that a weapon has been loaded or fired, it can also immediately lock down doors, send notifications out, send text messages, do all of those things. Assuming that a shooting unfortunately has started, the next area of concern is going to be keeping track of staff and students. And that's going to be done using a few ways. One is if it's an older clientele, so a high school, the majority of kids likely have their phone with them. So you might start seeing some phone-based solutions used for this. In the case of younger children, it's probably more based on solutions like RFID or Bluetooth. And this will help perhaps not only the parents, but even the school to know where all the kids are during the event of an unfortunate shooting. The last area has to do with bigger schools. So whether that's a university campus or a very large private school, perhaps. One of the concerns there is the open areas in the case of a sniper shooter. Again, you're starting to see IoT play a role in that. Whether it's alarms that are being sent out to people to take cover, whether it's panic spots and different shelters that will open up in the event of an issue, there's a few ways that IoT is definitely helping to keep kids safe. And you know what? Based on the number of shootings we see, we can't have enough solutions coming to market. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. I look forward to having you listen to future ones every Thursday. And I also recommend that you look at our new webpage, the Internet of Things Made Simple.com. And I humbly ask that you subscribe to this podcast using your favorite podcast service. Thanks again for listening. I'm Larry Bohumor.